Andrew Rimby is a PhD candidate and queer activist at Stony Brook University, researching 19th century literature from a queer transatlantic perspective. He's the 2019 inaugural recipient of the Giuliano Global Fellowship, a 2019-2020 Public Humanities Fellow, and a 2019 Stony Brook Graduate Fellow in the Arts, Humanities, and Lettered Social Sciences. With Adam Katz, he co-anchors the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, a podcast about navigating academia during the pandemic. His article on teaching Whitman during the pandemic is about to appear in 19th century gender studies. He's also the associate editor for the Whartons Review and a board member of the Walt Whitman Initiative. So I will now turn it over to you, Andrew. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So thank you all who are watching. Technology, sometimes we hit these snags. So I appreciate everyone working with me. So I am so excited to continue this presentation called Wharton's Long Secret Nights, A Queer Gilded Age Inheritance. It is a continuation from my talk, like Jeff said, about William Cullen Bryant and Walt Whitman's transcendental connection. So I just want to preface this by saying, first, I'm wearing my pride hat, but as we move on to the next slide, I'm going to do some performance art, and I'll take it off to go back into the late 19th century when LGBTQ categories didn't even exist because of terminology. So Edith Wharton and Walt Whitman may seem like unlikely figures to pair together. However, soon you'll learn that Edith Wharton actually had so many moments of absorbing Whitman's poetry, prose, alluding to him in her own work. So we can go to the next slide, please. Wonderful. So where we left off last was William Cullen Bryant had died in New York City. I talked a lot about Cedarmere. I'll take the hat off. And William Cullen Bryant, I had alluded to him being the nephew of a very prominent figure, Charity Bryant, who had been in America's first same-sex union, as scholars note. And there you can see there's actually a historical book written about Charity and her partner, Sylvia. So even though William Cullen Bryant doesn't necessarily comment extensively on their relationship together, there is a lot of his aunt's union in the conversation of the 19th century. I wanted to start that off because, like we had left off last time, William Cullen Bryant had actually been in that milieu of New York society that Edith Wharton had been born into. Edith Wharton was a blue blood. She came from an old money family. Unlike William Cullen Bryant, who I've done more work with Cedarmere, and they've helped inform me about William Cullen Bryant growing up in a farm in Massachusetts. And he didn't have inherited money, but he eventually became a lawyer. So he did make his money. There is this almost new money lineage with William Cullen Bryant, even though new money isn't necessarily a popular term in the mid-19th century. Edith Wharton talks a lot about the Nova Riche, that new money class. And I'll get a little into that. So I just want to say we are leaving William Cullen Bryant, so I want to bid him adieu, but of course he's always part of this conversation. And I want to head right into Edith Wharton. So we can move to the next slide. Wonderful. So Walt Whitman, as I had said before, and if you weren't at the last presentation, don't worry. I consider this almost a soap opera continuation of Walt Whitman, where you don't necessarily need to have known the last episode. So you're exactly where you need to be. So Walt Whitman, he writes about the Gilded Age a little. He talks about it in his work, Democratic Vistas. He talks exclusively about the materialism of the period, how there's this crassiness of the Gilded Age, and critiques it. He critiques the excessive wealth and materialism. In a way, Edith Wharton will do similar work in her Gilded Age novels, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself with that. The term Gilded Age actually comes from the Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner novel, The Gilded Age. As you can see, a beautiful copy there. And I just want to read that quote there. So, as Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner say, it is a time when one's spirit is subdued and sad. One knows not why, when the past seems a storm-swept desolation, life a vanity and a burden, and the future but a way to death. It is a time when one is filled with vague longings, when one dreams of flight to peaceful islands in the remote solitudes of the sea, or folds his hands and says, "What is the use of struggling and toiling and worrying anymore? Let us give it all up." So, and forgive me, I eventually, because of my technology being on my cell phone, I might have to go back and forth. So you'll see some very close-up shots of my face. A very pessimistic outlook, you could say, in this satirical novel. It is Mark Twain, so of course he is dabbling in the satiric novel. Charles Dudley Warner was actually his Hartford neighbor when Mark Twain was living in Connecticut. They had written this together. So, like how Whitman describes the crassness, Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner describe this desolate aspect. And I want to note too that this is not the first time that Walt Whitman has talked about this materialist wealth of the Gilded Age. When he was writing back and forth to his mother, Louisa Van Velser, who, if you've heard me talk, you've already heard this, but Louisa Van Velser was born to a Quaker family in Cold Spring Harbor. And she lived almost the rest of her life on Long Island, except for when she got very sick and had to move with her son, George Whitman, to Camden, New Jersey. But that's for another talk. That's for the talk on Whitman in New Jersey, maybe a future one. But we're back on Long Island. We're back in the Gilded Age. And Whitman actually corresponds while his mom is sometimes summering in Roslyn Harbor. But when I say she's summering, because this is the 1860s, I don't mean summering in the way that a character like Lily Bart in Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth will be summering. And you'll see a quote about that soon to come. And if I can get my audio working, I might even have us listen to a little of the BBC dramatization of The House of Mirth. So you can hear the cadence of the language, which is so important to New York's society of the late 19th century. But as you see here, Whitman in 1889, he's talking to his biographer, Horace Traubel, about Roslyn. He says, and this is Horace Traubel quoting what Whitman was saying to him, quote, "So Whitman spoke of Long Island, of Bryan's home, okay, of Cedarmere, and apparently notes that it's cliffy. It is, as I talked about before, where Cedarmere is, it is nestled in this cove where the Nassau County Art Museum is, which was part of William Cullen Bryant's property at that time, is up on a hill. So Whitman, though, does get the history wrong. I've been corrected, so I want to make my correction. I thank the Board of Trustees at Cedarmere who told me about this history, Tom in particular. Thank you, Tom. So Whitman says that it was called Mosquito Cove, talking about Roslyn Harbor. I did a little digging after Tom told me that it was actually Glen Cove was what was Mosquito Cove. But Whitman is always on this liminal space of myth and reality. So for Whitman, it makes a lot of sense. He probably heard locals talking about Mosquito Cove. Maybe he thinks that it's Roslyn Harbor. However, these myths continue. He really is interested in how what was once this farmland or land that was part of specifically the Matinacock tribe, the Native American tribe was that area in Roslyn, that now it is home to these wealthy estates. And Whitman is right at that edge point. He dies in 1892, where the Gilded Age mansions are starting to be built, but he's not yet in that point where Edith Wharton is nestled, where the excessive nature of the mansions, especially what the turn of the century, what we think of as the Gilded Age mansions, most of them are right in that 1890, 1900 period. And then, don't worry, I had to mention the Great Gatsby. So we'll get there, but we are nowhere near the Roaring 20s yet. Okay, we can move on. Thank you. So, Wharton's Long Island connection. So Edith Wharton, like I said, was born to a blue blood family. And actually, Jeff is being so helpful as my technical guide and guru here. Can you click on the YouTube video, please? I want you to actually just watch about 4 minutes of this BBC documentary. It was called Edith Wharton, A Lady Doesn't Write, from the 1990s. That way you can actually see the kind of milieu, the kind of society that she was born into. So I'll have us watch just a short clip. And in that clip, you actually will be introduced to the Mount, which was Edith Wharton's country house. So in the meantime, too, I'll talk a little about why I chose the Nassau County Museum of Art as my graphic there. But once we have that video up, here we go. Sit back and enjoy it.
Edith Wharton has been not popular for a long time because she committed the way I've seen it is that she committed the unforgivable sin. You can kill somebody, you can do all kinds of things, but if you're a snob, we don't forgive that. I have sometimes thought that a woman's nature is like a great house full of rooms. There's the hall through which everyone passes in going in and out. The drawing room where one receives formal visits. The sitting room where the members of the family come and go as they list. But beyond that, far beyond, are other rooms, the handles of whose doors are never turned. No one knows the way to them, no one knows whither they lead. And in the innermost room, the Holy of Holies, the soul sits alone and waits for a footstep that never comes.
No one before her, and I'm not sure about after her, no one before her had ever described, portrayed the position of women in American society, the status of women, the way they're treated, what is expected of them, and to put it into the single figure she used most often. Life for the American woman was a prison, was an entrapment, and there was no escape from it.
named after the building that housed our first government federal hall. Now remember, I'm not talking about our 5th president. I'm not talking about our 30th president. I'm talking about our first. That's what makes this spot so historically significant in history.
Okay, that's good. Thank you, Jeff. So if you would like, that is up on YouTube. Thank you, BBC, for it's a whole biography about Edith Wharton. And because I'm only delving very briefly, and I know there's some Wharton scholars here. Hi, everyone. Because I do mostly situate myself in Whitman studies, I don't go so far into the biography, but if you have to start with scholars, you'll see a few of them mentioned here, because a few of them, like Carol Singley, have been so gracious and helpful, and Sheila Limming. But Cynthia Griffin Wolf's biography, you saw Louis Auchincloss there. He was one of Wharton's biographers, a very good biography. So you can learn all about her blue blood connections. And I will give you a little tidbit because I always love this when I learned about Edith Wharton. Her name was actually Edith Newbold Jones. And her last name Jones, I'm sure many of you have heard that phrase, keeping up with the Joneses. Well, it came from her family lineage. So there's some white Anglo-Saxon Protestant history and mythology too. But actually, is it okay if we just go back one, Jeff? I'm going to try to make this work. Here is my first introduction to Edith Wharton. Was not via Ethan Frome, which when I talk to many millennials, I am a millennial, many of them had to read Ethan Frome in high school. I actually was introduced to Edith Wharton, not in high school, but when I was an undergrad. I was introduced to The House of Mirth, published in 1905. And that's actually where Rosalind is referenced. As you can see, book 2, chapter 5, there's a reference to the Van Alsten place. And there is a family called the Gormers who are vacationing, summering in this estate in Roslyn. I'm going to see if we can actually hear this moment in the dramatization because it is so well captures the dialect and slang of Lily Bart. She's the protagonist of the society that Lily Bart is situated in. Okay, so I think this will work. Something new that I'm trying with Jeff. So if it doesn't work, that's okay. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. And if it doesn't, I will give you the location to find this. Okay. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. Can you see when I open up Audible, Jeff?
Yes. Yep, I see it.
Cool. Okay, this might be very exciting. I hope you can hear it. I'll just play a little clip and just let me know, please, if you can hear it. Here you go. Can you hear that, Jeff?
No, I'm not hearing it, Andrew, unfortunately.
Oh, no. Here, I'll try one more time.
You could just try playing it out loud without, just playing it out loud where.
Can you hear that?
No, unfortunately not.
No. Okay. I tried. Let's see. Well, yeah, I feel like there's something with sharing my sound. But I don't want to, spend too much time doing it. Wait, let me try one more, one more setting.
Oh, God.
Sounds good. So, Andrew, I heard something for just a second or two there.
But if I can do anything to help you realize the folly of your ways, and how deeply Cousin Julia disapproved, I shall feel it is the truest way I can make up to you for her loss.
Thank you, Grace. I'll see myself out. Goodbye. Oh, God. Lily! Good heavens, Carrie! Where did you spring from?
I was just passing when I spotted you. Oh, look here, Lily. Don't let's beat about the bush. Half the trouble in life is caused pretending there isn't any. That's not my way, but we'll talk of that by and by. I don't suppose you're keeping house in there with a sanctimonious Grace, are you? It struck me that you might be rather at a loose end.
Well, to tell you the truth, I am at a loose end for the moment. But Gertie Farish is still in town, and she's good enough to let me be with her whenever she can spare the time.
Well, that's a somewhat temperate joy. Well, I know Gertie's a trump and worth all the rest of us put together. But all along, you're used to a little higher seasoning, aren't you? Besides, I suppose even she'll be off before long. Now, look here, Lily. You can't spend your summer in town. We'll talk of that later, too. Meanwhile, what do you say to putting a few things together in a valise and coming down with me to the Sam Gormers tonight?
Carrie, you can't be serious. The Gormers? I've never even met them.
Well, you don't know them and they don't know you, but that doesn't make a rap of difference. They've taken the Van Alstyne house at Roslyn, and I've got carte blanche to bring my friends down there. The more the merrier with them. They do things awfully well, you know, and there's to be a rather jolly party this weekend. I don't mean exactly your particular set, rather a different crowd, but still very good fun. The Gormers have struck out on a line of their own.
What does that mean?
It means that what they want is to have a good time and to have it in their own way. They've decided that the whole formal business bored them, and that what they needed was a crowd they could really feel at home with.
So, Andrew, you want me to go back to sharing?
Oh, that's perfect. Yes. So you could hear all of that?
Yes. Yep.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. You helped me. You helped me figure out a new method for audiobooks. I might be using that in my teaching. So as you could hear, I really wanted everyone to get a sense of, oh, and that was the BBC dramatization of The House of Mirth. I really wanted you to get a sense of the language, the social connections, but in that clip especially, you hear how Lily Bard is not exactly impressed by the Gurmers at the Van Alstyne place, because the Gurmers have found new money connections, and that is suspicious to Lily Bard's own money, My Lou, even though if you know the narrative, and I won't spoil it, Lily Bard is starting to fall from her social station. But what Bryant and Whitman were living, they were not yet in that type of new money atmosphere. Okay, we can go to the next one. Thank you, Jeff. So how does Edith Wharton actually come to know Walt Whitman's work? Well, Edith Wharton, there's actually still two editions of Leaves of Grass in the Mount, which is the country house that she built in the early 1900s in Lenox, Massachusetts, which I urge everyone to visit. I have not visited yet, but I do have plans to visit it in August. So I'm really going to try to do a whole week in Lenox, Massachusetts. Going to try to relive maybe the writing energy that had happened in the Berkshires. Okay, so Edith Wharton gets her hands on what you see there is the 1897 edition. From 1898, her friend Walter Van Rensselaer Berry gifts her this edition of Leaves of Grass. She first meets Walter Berry in Bar Harbor, Maine when she's 21. She's unmarried at that time. Berry begins to pursue a legal career and they continue a friendship. So what I have here is what Edith Wharton would have been drawn to is, we'll talk about the sensual erotic queering that starts to happen with Wharton's own prose. One prose that's not usually discussed a lot because they're not necessarily as canonical, but I'm putting them in the conversation because they are very important for Wharton's poetic discovery. But you can see here from the Mount that Leaves of Grass was something to be kept under lock and key, is the quote. And Edith Wharton was actually discouraged from reading Leaves of Grass in public. So there was already this type of, you could call it a mythology of eroticism in Whitman's poetry, but this sordid nature to Whitman's poetry, that there was something unsavory, something not necessarily genteel, and I'm going to really go into what that could be. I also really love this quote. That quote, he sees through the layers of the conventional point of view and of the conventional adjective straight to the thing itself and to the endless thread connecting it with the universe. And that is in Wharton's terminology. And there is Carol Singley's book, Edith Wharton, Matters of Mind and Spirit, which she does a really wonderful job bringing into the conversation Wharton's reading history of Walt Whitman. So I encourage everyone to get their hands on that. Okay, so let's go into the sensual imagery. We can turn to the next slide. Okay, so Wharton's fascination with Whitman. It's actually a lengthy timeline. And there's a beautiful image of Edith Wharton's home, the Mount, that she actually did decorate herself and design. If you didn't know this too, Edith Wharton wrote about decorating homes. So she actually dabbles into decorative arts as well. Edith Wharton, like Walt Whitman, wears many hats. Edith Wharton's society is very different than Walt Whitman, but they actually share a lot of commonalities with dabbling in all of their different passions. So let me just go through some of this timeline because it is important. What really draws Wharton to Whitman at first is the idea of transcendentalism. In 1898, Wharton actually says that Whitman's Leaves of Grass is one of her favorite books. And just a reminder, transcendentalism is that belief that sprung out of New England with Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. I talked a lot about it in the William Cullen Bryant discussion because of him being a transcendentalist with a lot of his poetry. But it really is, if you had to give a boilerplate, transcendentalism is that poetic idea that there is this essential unity of creation, that there is this inherent good in humanity. And where do they find that inherent good? They find it outside themselves in nature. So if you ever get questioned or if you get on Jeopardy and you have to know about transcendentalism, hopefully that helps. 1904, I love all of these literary histories because you cannot make up these connections. Edith Wharton and Henry James are actually driving around Lenox, Massachusetts to actually go to Edith Wharton's home. Henry James has come there for a visit. And who do they read but Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass? Henry James brings it out and they start to pore over the free verse nature of his poetry, which Edith Wharton talks a lot about how much she enjoys the free verse form that Whitman offers. In 1908, thanks to Susan Goodman in 1992, she discovered these 11 handwritten notes for an essay that unfortunately Edith Wharton didn't publish, but it was supposed to be called Sketch of an Essay on Walt Whitman. I'll talk a little more about it and maybe why she didn't publish it. There's no concrete reason, but it might have to do something with sensuality. In The Custom of the Country, that is one of Wharton's infamous Gilded Age novels. In 1913, she writes it. Ralph Marvell is a character there, and he recognizes Whitman's poetic greatness, and he wants to try to write an essay that he never finishes about Whitman. So, life imitating art. In 1917, I had already told you that Wharton had read a little bit about Whitman's biography by Horace Traubel, but in 1917, she does a very deep dive into With Walt Whitman at Camden, and she actually reads the section, Whitman's essay called A Backward Glance Over Traveled Roads. And in 1934, she writes her autobiography. And what do you know? Her autobiography is called A Backward Glance. And again, a lot of this comes from Carol Singley's work on Edith Wharton. So thank you for that, Carol Singley. We can now move to the next slide. And if you thought that was the end of Wharton alluding to Whitman in her writing, you would be mistaken. Edith Wharton has a section, well, not a section, she has a collection of 4 novellas called Old New York is the collection. But each of the novellas, so here it is called The Spark, the 60s. So the 1860s, but she goes in order of the decades, right? So this is only one part, and she tries to capture what New York would have been like. Well, in the 1860s, you know this if you've read Whitman. Whitman writes drum taps about his experience as a Civil War nurse in Washington, D.C. He writes memoranda during the war. Well, Edith Wharton is really interested in this Civil War lineage with Walt Whitman. And when she writes her novella, The Spark, she has, and this is actually, it's almost a spoiler because it happens in the final page of the novella, but this is where Walt Whitman really does make his entrance. One of the characters connects to Walt Whitman because one of the characters is involved in the Civil War and discusses the issue of wounded bodies. And who better to turn to than Walt Whitman, who's writing poetry about his experience being a Civil War nurse. I just want to read this quote here because it does capture a lot of what Wharton has already been absorbing about Walt Whitman. So here we go again. We're back to his poetic form of free verse. Quote, and this is the character speaking. I was puzzled for a moment then. Why poetry? Rather a free form, of course. You see, he was an originator of new verse forms. We don't yet necessarily know who the he is except a poet. New verse forms, Delane echoed forlornly. He stood up in his heavy way, but did not offer to take the book from me again. I saw on his face the symptoms of approaching departure. Well, I'm glad to have seen his picture after all these years, he said. And on the threshold, he paused to ask, what was his name, by the way? When I told him, he repeated it with a smile of slow relish. Yes, that's it. Old Walt. That was what all the fellows used to call him. He was a great chap. I'll never forget him. I rather wish, though, he added in his mildest tone of reproach, you hadn't told me that he wrote all that rubbish. Okay, so he had not only enjoyed Walt Whitman's poetry, he knew about Walt Whitman and might have even met Walt Whitman. So Walt Whitman really is a ghost in this novella. Okay, we can move to the next. And I also should have said before we began the presentation, I'm really giving you an Edith Wharton book list at the same time, as I always like to do in these lectures. It's always good to want to read more. So The Spark is one of those cases. So you can actually know who is Delane and what is this whole climax happening at the end of the novella. Okay, well, if you don't know where to start with Whitman's homoerotic poetry, and especially queerness, look no further than City of Orgies. And I really always love this Walt Whitman bridge image in Philadelphia when they were going to paint it with the rainbow flag. That did not come to fruition, but it's nice to have the design there. I think Edith Wharton would have liked that with her decorative background. So let me just read City of Orgies because it is one of those poems that I think has to be heard in full. City of orgies, walks and joys, city whom that I have lived and sung in your midst will one day make you illustrious. Not the pageants of you, not your shifting tableaus, your spectacles repay me. Not the interminable rows of your houses, nor the ships at the wharves, nor the processions in the streets, nor the bright windows with goods in them, nor to converse with learned persons, or bear my share in the soiree or feast, not those. But as I pass, O Manhattan, your frequent and swift flash of eyes offering me love, offering response to my own, these repay me. Lovers, continual lovers, only repay me. Okay, and that's written in 1860. So I always analyze this poem in terms of cruising, in terms of men encountering other men on the street and the speaker really wanting to make these erotic connections. But it's not the male body that is only doing the cruising. No, it's this personification of Manhattan. So the city itself becomes this cruising force. And that's where my dissertation goes with this. So to be continued when I write my book from the dissertation, which should be finished in a few months. The dissertation, that is. Okay, we can turn to the next. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, I am so excited to be in conversation with the following writer, Lev Raphael. He's very well known for his queer Jewish voice. I actually first got introduced to Lev Raphael from my friend, Erica, who's part of my Ivory Tower Boiler Room podcast team. And she introduced me to the text on the left, Dancing on Tisha B'Av, which is really solidifies Lev Raphael exploring homoerotic Jewish culture and connections. So Lev Raphael helped me really start to think about Edith Wharton in this queer homoerotic way, because he wrote this novel in 1997. It is a murder mystery. It's his Nick Hoffman series. It's called The Edith Wharton Murders. And you might ask, how does Edith Wharton get into a murder mystery? Well, I do want to point you to the New York Times book review that is so well done, where Marilyn Stasio says, quote, "Is vulgar literary taste sufficient motive for murder? Actually, killing is too kind for the vindictive scholars in Lev Raphael's maliciously funny campus mystery." At first, when I read that, I thought it said campy mystery, and I think there is. Raphael has a campiness to his writing in the Edith Wharton Murders. So campus, campy, you could do an interesting read with that. I also want to read you, I've been in email conversation with Lev Raphael. We're very lucky. He's going to be doing an interview for the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. So please check out the website that Jeff sent in the chat, because his interview will be coming out in July. I want to read you his response. I asked him, how did he first settle on Wharton as the central figure in the Edith Wharton Murders? Short premise is basically Nick Hoffman is trying to get tenure, and he is the one who's tasked with creating this Edith Wharton conference for his English department. However, he's at the State University of Michigan, and Raphael comments that it's actually the criticism about the State University of Michigan is the acronym, the State University of Men, and that there needs to be more of this feminist recovery. So they settle on Edith Wharton as the figure, and these Wharton societies start to actually war with each other over their critical ideas, and it leads into an actual murder. So it's very, I have to love the academic murder mystery aspect. I think Wharton, she would definitely have really loved this tantalizing, gossipy murder. So Raphael says he landed on Wharton because, quote, "I was lucky with Wharton diving into her oeuvre in senior year of college, with writers like Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence, Durrell, Fitzgerald, George Eliot, and of course, James. The amazing scene in the House of Mirth where Lily is humiliated in France spoke to me about my own shame. That summer, the first major new bio about her came out, and a few years later in my MFA program, I took a seminar with Cynthia Griffin Wolf, who wrote the other big book about Edith Wharton in that period." Okay, and you can learn more about, definitely check out Lev Raphael's Prisoners of Shame text, where he really talks a lot about how he found shame in Edith, how the sense of queer shame connected to what he saw, like he says about Lily Bard, feeling this societal collapse of shame in France. There's this very important moment in the House of Mirth where Lily Bard is in Paris. Okay, so now let's see where this queer poetics happens in Edith Wharton's texts. Okay, we can move to the next. Okay. So Wharton gravitates towards not only Whitman's free verse, which is important and I've outlined, but Whitman's sensual verse. So a few examples. Quote, "Whitman has a speaker sing the song of procreation, singing the need of superb children and therein superb grown people." That's from Pen Up Aching Rivers. From Song of Myself, we have, quote, "The smoke of my own breath, echoes, ripples, buzz whispers, love root, silk thread, crotch, vine, my respiration and inspiration, the beating of my heart, the passing of blood and air through my lungs." You can't get any more sensual and sexual than the crotch, and the crotch being automatically then absorbed by the vine of nature. Again, Whitman is really interested in this naturalism and eroticism, how nature is this erotic space. Well, Wharton, as Carol Singley notes here, Edith Wharton's praise for Whitman's poetry and philosophy was nothing less than a celebration of her own sensuality, her own, quote, animal nature. Whitman granted permission to engage guilt-free in the pulsating rhythms of life and feel oneself immersed and reflected in nature. Okay, we can move to the next. So Edith Wharton in 1909 writes what a lot of Wharton scholars call her most Whitmanic poem. It's called Terminus, meaning a final destination place would be a terminus, the terminal, right? When you take the railroad, you have different terminals. When you take a plane, it's an arrival point. Okay, so I want to just read, it is a lengthier poem. It's about 1.5 pages. So I definitely urge you to read it all. But let me just read the very, very erotically charged moments that you'll see, again, harken back to Whitman. Quote, "Wonderful were the long secret nights you gave me, my lover. Palm to palm, breast to breast in the gloom, the faint red lamp flushing with magical shadows, the commonplace room of the inn with its dull, impersonal furniture, kindled a mystic flame with the pressure of bodies ecstatic, bodies like ours, seeking each other's souls in the depths of unfathomed caresses, and through the long windings of passion emerging again to the stars." Oh, you can feel there is this whole scene of these lovers in bed, and it's actually them being in a bed full of soot. And Edith Wharton then uses the adjective grime to describe the brasses of the bed. So there's definitely sexual acts happening in this bed. And you can see that even in what I just read about bodies being ecstatic, bodies like ours. It sounds exactly very, very reminiscent of Whitman's Song of Myself. But it is also uniquely Whartonian in how she expresses this act. I love Wharton's poetry. It is such an interesting experience when you read. If you've been introduced a lot, like I have, to Wharton's Gilded Age novels, it's interesting to see what's under the surface of, say, Lily Bart's sexuality. Well, I would say go to Terminus for that. I just want to read a short quote from Whitman in Paths Untrodden in 1860. He writes, quote, "I proceed for all who are or have been young men to tell the secret of my nights and days, to celebrate the need of comrades. The secret of my nights and days, in Terminus we have the long secret nights you gave me." So this language is continually part of Whitman's verse being expanded by other authors. Okay, now let's see Edith Wharton writing erotica, which might seem like a surprise. So we'll turn to the next. Okay, if you are very invested in Wharton's biography, you probably know who William Morton Fullerton is. He was a publisher who actually is the one who helped Wharton publish The House of Mirth in French, and especially be published in Paris. They had a brief affair. Some scholars do say that the affair ended right before she wrote Terminus, so this could be her thinking about their relations together. I do want to note that William Morton Fullerton was also a noted bisexual publisher and had actually affairs with the philosopher George Santayana and a few other men. So Wharton was around a very cosmopolitan, openly erotic group. However, she knew the limit of how to be publishable. Why say this erotic piece? It's called Beatrice Palmato. It's unfinished. Wharton had planned for it to be actually a full-length work, a novel. And I will only read a brief section from it. And again, if you have William Morton Fullerton and Edith Wharton in bed in your mind, this might again add another layer of, you know, how much is the biography coming into the story. So, quote, this is Mr. Palmato. He is having a sexual encounter with Beatrice. And now, darling, Mr. Palmato said, drawing her to the deep divan, let me show you what only you and I have the right to show each other. He caught her wrist as he spoke, and looking straight into her eyes, repeated in a penetrating whisper, only you and I. But his touch had never been tenderer. Already she felt every fiber vibrating under it, as of old, only now with the more passionate eagerness bred of privation and of the dull misery of her marriage. She let herself sink backward among the pillows, and already Mr. Palmato was on his knees at her side, his face close to hers. Again, her burning lips were parted by his tongue, and she felt it insinuate itself between her teeth and plunge into the depths of her mouth in a long, searching caress, while at the same moment his hand softly parted the thin folds of her wrapper. And I'm going to leave it at that. You can read everything that has been released about it online. However, there is a very, very queer, but even very troubling aspect of this narrative as well, which is that it actually may be between father and daughter, which might also be why Edith Wharton didn't release this, because of all these taboos she was exploring, not even with just the erotica, very reminiscent of 50 Shades of Grey when I just read that passage, but that there might even be this incestuous line that she was exploring. So Edith Wharton dabbled in this. This is part of her imaginative, of her erotic imaginative poetics. Okay, we can turn to the next. I'm almost at the end. Okay, so this is another celebrated year right now in 2021. Edith Wharton won in 1921. She became the first woman to win a Pulitzer Prize. She won for The Age of Innocence, which in 1920 celebrated its centennial. However, I do have here Wharton Faces Opposition is what I've called it, but it's the note from the jury of the Pulitzer Prize saying that they actually nominated Main Street, the novel Main Street by Sinclair Lewis, for the prize, but that their decision was overturned for the nomination of Edith Wharton to win for The Age of Innocence. I am so thankful Edith Wharton won for The Age of Innocence, but again, I want to show you that it's not like Edith Wharton, even though she is one of the wealthiest writers, to have been so marketable with her writing. She faced obstacles too by being a female writer, even in the 1920s. I want to draw you to What a Library Means to a Woman, a recent book that Sheila Lemming, the Wharton scholars, discussed about this connection between libraries and self-making, and especially Edith Wharton's library. I'll show you a picture of what that looks like at the Mount that you can all see. I can't wait to see it. I'm so excited to go to the Mount. And why we still are able to see her collection of Whitman's poetry, because Edith Wharton really did create this private library for herself and was really interested in this self-fashioning, as you already could tell with her interest in the decorative arts. Okay, and we're almost at the end. I have to turn to The Great Gatsby, so this is the next slide. And I call it the Gold Coast during Pride 2021. There are all of The Great Gatsby editions in 1925. It was published. This is also a year of celebration because The Great Gatsby is now in the public domain, which means you can get it online, and you can also now get cheaper copies. On the right is actually where F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote a lot of The Great Gatsby. That is the home in Great Neck. I don't know, in my head, I always thought F. Scott Fitzgerald kind of lived like Nick Carraway, his protagonist, in a cabin in Great Neck, but no. That is not a cabin. That is a mansion. So, well, I guess it depends on how you define mansion, but we don't have to get into that semantics. That's a whole other lecture on the Gilded Age mansions. So I do want to read how even Edith Wharton, she wins the Pulitzer in 1921. The Great Gatsby is published in 1925. F. Scott Fitzgerald is Edith Wharton's, is younger comparatively to Edith Wharton. And he's writing about that current moment of the excessive, indulgent decadence of the Roaring 20s. Edith Wharton wrote The Age of Innocence in 1920, but she goes back. She still returns back to the late 19th century, to the Gilded Age, to this turn in industry. So I just wanted to explain, a lot of times we think these writers are really separate, but they actually, a lot of the times are part of the same communities, but they're interested in different questions. However, there is a very homoerotic nature in The Great Gatsby. So I just want to read this quote when Nick Carraway describes Jay Gatsby. He says, quote, "If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there is something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away." And I urge everyone to reread The Great Gatsby with the idea of Nick Carraway's fantasizing of Jay Gatsby, because Nick Carraway spends most of his time in the novel trying to explain to himself why he adores Jay Gatsby so much. And F. Scott Fitzgerald critics have started to think about, well, maybe it's because Nick Carraway has a romantic investment in Jay Gatsby, which I do think is definitely there and exists. And continues what we've already seen with Edith Wharton and her discussion of sexuality that in her Gilded Age novels do seem to really be buried. And there's a lot more of these voids of the scandal or what's going to come of the affair. And I do want to end and explain that Edith Wharton actually told Fullerton, her lover, to destroy any love letter she had written to him because she was afraid of scandal. So like I said, Edith Wharton was aware, of course, of all of these erotic connections and in Whitman's poetry, in her own circle of queerness. But she always knew that there was a breaking point where she would, if she had too much scandal, she would no longer be read. And that kind of goes back to the documentary where the etiquette expert at the beginning says, Edith Wharton was very careful, and some had seen her as being too snobbish, but I would actually urge she was also very, very cautious of not being seen as too non-normative, especially when it came to sensuality and eroticism. Okay, and I'm ending on the last slide. So this is my acknowledgements. First, here is the library. I promised you it. Here's the library at the Mount. I hope to see some of you there when I go in August. We'll have to plan a day to go to the Mount. I have one of the links is my walking tour at Cedarmere. It begins at Cedarmere and it ends at the William Cullen Bryant Library in Roslyn. It's a historic tour of Roslyn, but a lot of it is also going to bring what I've discussed about William Cullen Bryant, Walt Whitman, and Edith Wharton, really show the visuals. I actually have a video I'm really excited about that the Nassau County Museum of Art let me film of their sculpture garden. That's the intermission period. You get to watch that video. We actually have a Tom from Cedarmere. He is the vice president. He's actually going to give us a private tour of the house at the beginning, which is so kind of Cedarmere. And then you'll get to see the grist mill of Roslyn and the whole historic town. So please check that out. It is next Sunday. I can't believe how quick time is flying, at 2 p.m. Thanks to Lev Raphael, Carol Singley, Sheila Limming, Karen Carpenter, Susan Sheckle, Jeff Zay, Caitlin Shea, Cynthia Shore, Cedarmere, the Nassau County Museum of Art, the Mount, the Whitman Birthplace, the Whitman Initiative, the Port Washington Library, Stony Brook University, and of course, my writing group, who they hear every day how I am processing all of this scholarship. So thank you all. Thank you all for staying there with me during this Mercury retrograde technology void with turning to my cell phone. But it actually, I think, worked out really well because I got to play the audiobook through my cell phone. So thank you all. And thank you, Jeff, so much for being there with me with tech.